Right. Hello, everyone. We are in for the second video of the month of January. I got that wrong last time. So we are in for the second video of the month of January, and thus the year of 2025. And going along with what I had kind of covered last week, we went a little bit into a little bit of Russian history, which I felt might be a little concordant because the Russians live in a cold climate, and we are right now in the United States. It just seems like we're getting one cold blast after another, and it almost feels like we're in Russia in terms of weather-wise. Obviously, not everything else. But last week we covered the Great Northern War. We did a brief little look over at that and how Russia ends up becoming a major European power at the expense of the Swedish Empire back about the early 18th century. So now we're going to go into a topic of Russian history that does deal a little bit with American history as well, especially for residents of the US state of Alaska, and that was Russian colonization efforts in North America. Many people are either not aware of or very vaguely, knowledgeable of the factor that Russia was colonizer in the Americas. It did colonize land in North America particularly. And its efforts, kind of like I had covered back in December with the Netherlands, are largely forgotten, except for the very ending where everyone knows that the United States bought Alaska from Russia, but no, not too many people know of the efforts of Russian colonization before the sale of Alaska. So that is what we're going to try to look at today. We're going to take a basic overview of the Russian colonization in North America, with primarily the emphasis being on the main Russian colonial settlements in Alaska. They did have some others elsewhere, like Northern California, there were a couple, but their main primary settlements are along the Alaskan coastline, and that was kind of where European settlement of Alaska began, was with the Russians. So that is what we're going to take a look at for today's video. So it's going to start fairly quickly. Russia, as we know, at the end of 1721, after the end of the Great Northern War, Peter the Great proclaims that Russia is now no longer the Tsardom of Russia; it is now the Russian Empire. Russia is now, in his view, and in the eyes of most of the world, it's now reigning over an enlarged state that is rapidly becoming a rapidly growing global empire. And Peter is looking to capitalize on that. He is now declared an empire. Now I want to expand it. I just expanded it in a war with Sweden, but now I want to expand eastward. I want to expand toward the Far East. And at the time, there's still the ongoing Russian conquest of modern day Siberia, which is, of course, now part of Russia. But back then, it was full of a bunch of different nomadic groups and tribes and stuff like that, and native peoples that had to largely be subjugated by the Russians in order to actually claim dominion over the territory. So that is going to be one of the Russians' first things that they really go toward. Now, expansion would enlarge Russia as well as maintain Russian dominance on the global fur trade, of which Russia was the main number one leading power in the fur trade by the mid 18th century. Fur would actually account for 10% of all of Russia's economic revenue that they had. By 1778, the conquest of Siberia, so long after Peter ended up dying. He died, I believe, 1725 is when he ended up actually passing away. But by 1778, the Russian Empire completed their conquest of Siberia after nearly 2 centuries of campaigns to try to subjugate it. So Siberia is now in their pocket. Where do they go from there? China is not really an option because other foreign European powers, such as Great Britain and France, are rapidly going to try to counter anything that Russia might try to do in terms of a Chinese invasion, because in terms of those great European powers, they have a lot of trade invested in China. They're not going to allow China to be bullied by this new major European power that they themselves see as a potential rival. So, exploration of what would be known as Alaska is going to actually begin before the conquest of Siberia was even completed. Now, while Russia had been aware that there of the potential riches in the Far East, it was largely unknown back at the time of Peter the Great what lands might lay in the North Pacific. They knew of the North Pacific, but they didn't exactly know, how far they knew of the New World, because obviously we'd known about that for up to that point about 2, 3 centuries. But they wondered how many, like, how close was it to Siberia? How close was it to the Far East? They didn't really know. and that was really a guessing game. In the year that Peter the Great died, in 1725, a Danish cartographer named Vitus Bering was commissioned by the Russian crown to explore lands in the northern Pacific, and any that he found he would have the authority to claim them for the Russian Empire. Bering would discover that Siberia extended much farther than previously known in terms of northward and eastward. He found that Siberia was much more vast than the Russians had previously thought it had. He also found that the Arctic waters in Russia's north were navigable for reaching the Pacific. It was possible to navigate Russia's far north through the Arctic Ocean to reach the Pacific Ocean, but mostly only at certain times of the year. In 1741, Bering would journey along the Alaskan coast. For the first time, Russian explorers would find Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. He discovered Alaska and Siberia were only separated by a very, very narrow strait. And of course, we all know what that strait is to this day. He also discovered that Alaska was full of sea otters, bountiful in sea otters, of which their pelts were the main driver of Russia's fur trade, and it was huge in territory size. But the one detriment he told when he come back, this place has some of the harshest weather you have ever encountered, which stands true to this day. Alaska, if you live up there, you know. Alaska is not the easiest place to live by any means. The weather is quite unpredictable. It can go from, mild in summer to absolutely bitterly cold in winter, and even before that. Let me see here. I do have a map. I mean, all of us know of Alaska. We all know what Alaska looks like and everything, but we're just going to use the map to kind of point some basic things out if we can. Okay. So the strait that Bering discovered ultimately, as we know, would come to bear his name of the Bering Strait. And the Bering Strait is the only thing that really separates Russia from Alaska. They're actually fairly close. And I do believe there are some islands in Alaska that if you look and you got clear enough view, you can see Russia from some Alaskan islands. Obviously, we know the Bering Strait is what would get Bering's name, and the Bering Sea, of course. So here's the Bering Sea. Here's Russia. Here's Alaska. Bering Sea is right here, and then this little strait is all that separates them. Very, very close for them to discover. We'll keep that aside because we're going to keep referring back to that at times. So Russian fur traders, or Promyshelniki, which were mostly from Siberia, they began funding voyages to the newly found land in Alaska, since it was supposedly rich with pelts that could be used to further Russia's dominance in the fur trade. So much like the Dutch had, as we discussed in December, the Dutch largely, when they went and started the colony of New Amsterdam, New Netherland, I mean. New Amsterdam was the city of what became New York. But when the Dutch came to North America and established their own colonial possessions, they weren't really going at it for domination like the British or the Spanish were. They were going at it for the economics of it, the economics and the revenue that colonial trade and the resources that could be developed in a colony could grant the mother country. That was why the Netherlands got involved. And ultimately, that was why they gave up so easily on the New Netherlands, was because by the time the English come knocking on the door, the system is not really working anymore. New Netherlands isn't as profitable as the Dutch had initially hoped it would be, and they were more than keen to just give it up. And there was more profitable colonies elsewhere that they could hold on to, mostly like those in Dutch East India or Indonesia. The Russians are largely the same way when they come into Alaska. They aren't so much going at it for Russian domination; they're going at it for economics, for the fur trade. That is what they want to continue to dominate. Alaska has a large population of sea otters, which are needed for their fur pelts. It's a prime hunting ground to get these furs to maintain that dominance. So that is what they primarily go to Alaska for. There was this continued demand to go to Alaska because by the time that these Plumashink are going to Alaska, the sea otter populations have been utterly devastated in Siberia. Siberia has been overhunted, almost the sea otter population almost to extinction, and thus there's not really any pelts to be had. So go to where they're now coming just over the ocean, just over the strait. There were more than 40 merchants who would sponsor expeditions to Alaska between 1740 and 1800. Now, the fur trade expeditions would boost the Russian government's interest in establishing bases in order to sustain territory claims and to protect the expeditions that were heading to Alaska. So this is going to start the process of the Russian government actually getting involved, where beforehand it's more or less just Russian trappers and fur hunters that are going after it. In 1784, Siberian noble slash merchant Grigory Ivanovich Shelikov would lead an expedition to Alaska's Kodiak Island. Some of you may know where Kodiak Island is, others do not. In case you need to know, I will circle it here. This is Kodiak Island. This is the location of the first permanent Russian settlements in Alaska. In 1784, they would establish the first Shilikov and his crew would establish the first permanent settlement in Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island in 1784, which would be the first permanent Russian settlement. Now, arriving on Kodiak Island, of course, Alaska is not entirely void of life. It's not entirely void of human life. There are indigenous natives there. There are tons of native tribes. And when the Russians arrive on Kodiak Island, they meet the native Aleut people, who the Aleutian Islands are named after. And the native Aleuts are not too friendly with these invaders as they view them, and they are invaders to their land. And the have kind of a little bit of a negative relationship with the Russians right from the start. They Russian colonists that come into Kodiak Island, they largely see the Aleuts as weak, lazy, they're too willful, and they largely see them as a possible source of labor. So they try to force them into hunting and finding food for the fur trappers, basically turning them into serfs, which was serfdom was still going on in Russia at that time. Infectious diseases from that the Russians brought with them, of course, just as had happened with lower mainland North America, the infectious European diseases that these Russians brought over decimated the native Aleut populations, and that didn't help them much either. Now, when the Russians landed on Kodiak Island, the native Alutiiq people, who were Aleutian by nature, but they were a tribe, the Alutiiq people attacked them almost immediately upon them landing on Kodiak Island. Shilikov, who was absolutely appalled that these savages, as would put them, would attack his, fine men, then ordered that the colonists subjugate the natives, who he listened as lazy and licentious, and ordered that only loyal natives who proclaimed allegiance to their new masters would be spared. The Russians would pursue the native Alutiiqs on Kodiak Island to a remote outpost on the north end of the island and then slaughtered most of the women and children while taking others hostage as a warning to other members of the tribe that if you resist us, this is what will happen. So the Russians wasted no time quickly souring any relations that they could have with the native indigenous peoples, and that largely in the future is going to come to hurt them just as much as they had the Dutch in New Netherland. The Dutch too had not fostered the greatest relationship with the Native Americans that they encountered, who could have been a good source of trade for furs, since they knew the land well and knew how to hunt those animals well, and could have just traded them and bartered them for the furs for European goods. Same thing with the Russians. They could have had that. They made the massive mistake right from the bat of, confronting these people as hostile savages that needed to be cleansed almost from the land that they were settling, which was not in any way correct and should never have been done. The indigenous relations with the Russians throughout the whole period of Russian colonization in Alaska would not really improve much either, because they would largely we're going to have a conflict when the Russians come in as part of the Russian crown's backing of these hunter trapper efforts to colonize Alaska. They're also demanding that they try to convert these indigenous peoples to Russian Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and of course, conversion efforts, just like it did with the Spanish, is not going to be the best option when you're trying to inflict on these native peoples' customs and beliefs, and that also soured relations even further. And let me see here. I do believe we have two images that would be relevant to go right now. Yes, we do. So here we have this is Grigory Shilikov, who is kind of the founder of the first permanent Russian settlement in Alaska. He was the big businessman that was going to be in charge of that. He was a Siberian noble. And then here we have the Russian settlement that he had founded on Kodiak Island, which would be their first permanent settlement in Alaska. So Shalikov would end up returning to Russia shortly by the end of the 1780s in order to get praise and gifts and everything from the Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great. So he's going to return to Russia by the end of this. And in his stead, while he goes back to Russia, he doesn't ever really return. Shalikov would appoint a good friend of his named Alexander Baranov to manage his Alaskan trade ventures, to basically manage this operation that he's got going on in Alaska. By the end of the 1790s, Shalikov's son would help to found, and Baranov both would help to found in 1799 a new trading venture company called the Russian American Company to basically be the governing hand of all Russian colonization efforts in Alaska. And Baranov would be appointed the first director of the company, making him the unofficial governor of the colony. Now, as the Russian American company was backed by the crown, much like the Dutch one had been, except they didn't have a crown, but it was backed by the government. But as the Russian American company was backed by the crown, it was expected to also expand Russian territory, trade, influence, and settlements in North America. So it was kind of meant to be the main governing body and expansion effort for this colonial possession that they had. Baranov would import from Russia to establish farms. He would build forts, open sawmills and tanneries, and even begin to develop Alaska's coal and iron reserves, which were quite plentiful for a frozen wasteland. Now, despite the rapid Russian expansion that's going to occur at the turn of the century, as the 19th century begins to dawn, the colony is mostly restricted to the Alaskan coastline. The Russians aren't really settling in the Alaskan interior. The conditions are too harsh. They're struggling enough as it is on the coast that they're not really looking at going into the Alaskan interior and trying to make things harder on themselves. They need to maintain access to the sea so they have access to trade and ships that are coming in to supply them. So, and that would also later cause a problem when the United States would buy Alaska in 1867 because a lot of the native Alaskan peoples would kind of argue that Russia had only been within its rights to sell like the coastlines of Alaska when they sold it to the United States, since Russia had never really settled the interior of Alaska. Even though Russia claimed it, they never really settled it, and thus the Alaskan natives would kind of claim that, well, when Russia sold it to you, they didn't have any permission to be selling this because they never even settled this. They sold you coastline, not the interior. And that would cause a bit of a stir between the natives and the US government for roughly up until about the early 20th century until they had an agreement come to that. In 1802, while away on a business trip, Baranov's men were ended up being attacked by the Twinglets at the settlement of Mikhailovsk, which was about 9 miles, I believe, 9 miles northeast of where Sitka is today, Sitka, Alaska. Which, if anyone wants to know where Sitka is, it's actually not that far from Juneau or Juneau. This is Sitka. So kind of over here on the, like I said, kind of along the coast. That's why this part of Alaska is part of Alaska, because those are Russian settlements on the coast at the time. So at Mikhailovsk, while Baranov is away on a business trip, the native Twinglets end up actually attacking the Russian settlers there. Baranov gets word of this, and he ends up coming back with a frigate and then proceeds to raise the entire native indigenous village that had attacked his city of Mikhailovsk. He would end up founding a new capital city for the colony of Novo-Archangelsk or New Archangel on the ruins of Mikhailovsk, which Novo-Archangelsk would later become the modern city of Sitka, Alaska. So that used to be the Russian colonial capital for Alaska was Sitka. And if you go there, there's still some remnants of Russian architecture. Mostly, there are a couple Russian Orthodox churches that are still that are still open in Sitka, and there's still a little bit of a presence there from those. The colonists in Alaska did struggle to get provisions, which was a major dampener on Russian efforts to kind of keep the land, kind of colonize it successfully. Ru- Russian American company ships only would visit about every 2 to 3 years due to the long journeys that they had to endure in order to give supplies. And many ships ended up not even arriving at all because many of them, due to the treacherous weather, they ended up getting lost in the North Pacific and never seen again. Alaska's harsh climate, once they actually got there, further would complicate matters of terms of colonialization. The lack of provisions would actually leave the Russian colonials dependent on British and American merchants in order to get their provisions and supplies for the colonies in order just to survive and avoid starvation. The Russians would focus on fur trapping to have furs in order to exchange for those supplies. So instead of selling those furs to other foreign markets, they're selling them just to maintain their provisions for the colony, which is going to be a downside pretty early on as to why Russia was kind of failing in some aspects in settling Alaska. They weren't adequately supplying the colonists in this harsh environment. The Americans were quite beneficial compared for the Russians to trade with because the Americans had access to the Chinese port of Guangzhou, where they could sell Russian furs that they bought, of which Russia at that time did not have open access to trade in the port of Guangzhou in China, and thus that was kind of a boon to them to make some money. Trade did lead to enroachment, however, on Russian land, which did worry the Russian government, and it did anger the board of directors of the RAC because they don't like that British and Americans are kind of encroaching on Russian territory, and then they're also mad at Baranov because he ended up trading over 2 million rubles in furs just for supplies with the Americans. Instead of sending them in terms of going to the government, it's just paying for supplies. And that is kind of angering the board of directors, but Baranov kind of points out to them, well, you're not supplying me well enough. What do you expect me to do? And speaking of Baranov, this is Alexander Baranov. This was the main first director of the Russian American company. He's the guy that kind of heads a lot of the early colonization efforts in Alaska. He takes over for Shalikov, and then he ends up passing away in 1819. And after his death, Alaska kind of started to go south as a Russian territory. And then here we have the depiction of the Battle of Sitka in 1802, of which the native Twinklets, it was when they were attacking the Russians after Baranov had left. Baranov would come back with a frigate, raise their village, and then found Novo Archangelsk on the ruins of Mikhailovsk, which they had destroyed. And then here we have the flag of the Russian American company. They had their own company flag, kind of based on the basic Russian tricolor flag, but also with the Romanov eagle, but a little bit of a different design than the imperial flag. And the city of Novo Archangelisk, or what would now be, some one day become Sitka, Alaska. This was a depiction of about 1806 of that port. And just to further explain how much money is going in just provisions, from 1806 to 1818, Baranov shipped over 15 million rubles in furs to Russia. And mind you, the company's getting mad at him because he spent 2 million on provisions while the company is raking in 15 million rubles back home, but they were only sending about 3 million back in provisions to sustain the colony. There's a little bit of an offset there. Excuse me. So RAC shareholder Nikolai Razanov, who was a shareholder in the Russian American Company, or RAC, he is a noted adventurer and an ardent Russian imperialist and a friend of Baranov's. And he ends up trying to find a solution to the provisions problem that the Russians are facing in Alaska in the early 1800s. So he buys a ship from American merchants and sets sails from Alaska to search for provisions in 1806. He decides to go south to the Spanish settlements in California, and Razanov would end up returning to Alaska with huge success. The Spanish had a ban in California on trade with outsiders, but upon arriving in California, Razanov and his men were actually able to successfully challenge the Spanish ban and get the Spanish to actually trade with them for provisions. And he ends up bringing back tons of much needed wheat and other foodstuffs. He also ends up marrying the daughter of the Spanish governor of California, and approval for a trade relationship between the Spanish colony in San Francisco and Alaska, which would further help Alaska's provision problem. Razanov would inform the Russian American company upon his return, though, of unclaimed lands in California north of San Francisco Bay, which he urged that Russia should rush in to claim, as they would be a vital link in securing this chain of trade between California and Alaska. He argued that this would be a vital link in doing that, that we should do it because they're not claimed by any other European power at this time. It'd be a grand opportunity. So he urges Baranov who expand into California. And Razanov would end up dying before Baranov ended up taking his advice. But eventually, Baranov does. And in 1812, the Russians would establish Fort Ross as their southernmost expansion point in North America in Sonoma County, California, just north of San Francisco. Fort Ross would actually help to supply Alaska with food and would be the southernmost settlement the Russians have. Most people are not aware that there was a Russian fort in California. So here is a picture of Razanov. He is the guy kind of responsible for expanding the Russian supply chain down to California to kind of keep Alaska supplied and well provisioned. He was the guy responsible for that. He ended up dying, of course, before they were able to really do anything. And then here we have a picture of, if you go to California today, they actually have a historic site set up where Fort Ross was. There's only one original remaining building. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's not the church though. This is they've largely reconstructed the site, and this is what they've reconstructed to make it look as it once did. This is the church in particular that was on the site in California. But you can go there. They have reconstructed. There's only one original building, but it is a historic site that you can go and visit if you ever go out to California. So, what is going to end up making Alaska get sold to the United States? Well, as we mentioned, Baranov died in 1819, and when he died, it left the colony with very, very weak leadership. None of the Russian American company managers that took and directors that took on after him were as skilled as he had been in terms of expanding and maintaining the colony. The RAC charter ended up getting renewed in 1821 by the Russian government, but the chief managers now had to be naval officers, who naval officers really don't have any experience in terms of trapping fur and fur hunting. They don't have any experience with that, which is going to further hurt the main economic drive of why this colony exists, because the managers aren't even fluent in the main source of trade and money. It would also stipulate that they wanted to cut off all contact with foreigners in Alaska, and that meant they didn't want any trade with British and American merchants, who many of the people in the Russian government and the higher ups of the Russian American company felt that they were kind of stealing a lot of the rubles away that should be heading to Russia, even though they didn't really realize they're out of touch. Because the main stipulation here being that we're trading with the British and the Americans because you guys are not sending us enough provisions. Now you're saying we can't even trade with them. Well, unless you're going to start supplying the colony more, that's just going to get ignored. And it did. It largely did get ignored. In 1824 and 1825, the British and Americans would actually sign treaties with Russia, which recognized Russian fur trade rights in Alaska, which for a time did quell some of the concern that the Russian government had on British and American encroachment, but at the same time, you know, the same thing that had happened in Siberia is rapidly happening in Alaska. The sea otter populations are rapidly declining due to overhunting, and eventually there's less and less fur pelts to be had, and the main source of revenue and purpose of this colony is rapidly becoming depleted. Fort Ross would actually end up being sold. Russia would no longer have a need to, with the new treaties that would come up in the 1820s, which also allow for the exchange of provisions. Russia really no longer had any purpose to maintain its base in Northern California because they now had much closer supply lines to provision Alaska, and thus Fort Ross ended up being sold off in the 1840s. As the 1860s neared, Alaska was no longer profitable to the Russians. It was becoming very rapidly an expensive venture, and they were also dealing with the prospect of, European expansion is happening in Africa, it's happening in Asia, and there are much larger colonies to possibly be had, much larger gains to be had. And while Alaska was a good gain early on, it's no longer profitable. It's becoming a hindrance. And they're also worried that the British, who are rapidly becoming a main Russian rival, could very easily invade Alaska and take it over from British Columbia, which is right next door. So, the number one thing that the Russians don't want to do, they're rapidly coming to the conclusion in the 1860s that Alaska is no longer profitable. We need to get rid of Alaska. It's becoming a hindrance. It just needs to go. But they're also realizing we don't want to let it fall into British hands. And that means Canada's not getting it. Mexico's too far south. So who can we sell it to in North America that is not British that we'd be willing to let have Alaska? And Tsar Alexander II would actually authorize negotiations to begin in 1867 in order to sell the colony to the United States. Since the United States at that time did not have the best relationship with Great Britain, it was still rather icy, especially due to British actions in terms of helping the Confederacy during the Civil War. Alexander kind of views that the United States is the perfect candidate to give Alaska to. At that point, they're not a major rival, they're not a major European power, which is another boon, and it would kind of block the British from getting a hold of that territory. On April 9th of 1867, the Russian Empire ended up selling Alaska to the United States for a total price of $7,200,000, or about 2 cents an acre. It was a relatively cheap buy for the size that Alaska is. Mind you, Alaska is like almost half the size of the continental lower 48. But at the time of the US buying of Alaska, many people absolutely thought it was a waste of money. They thought that Alaska, why would you buy this? This is a frozen wasteland. The Russians even admitted as such that it was pretty much useless to them. That's why they sold it. So why would you want to buy this? And for many years, that's what the people regarded it as. They regarded it as Seward's folly after the Secretary of State at the time who had been instrumental in securing the purchase of it. It wasn't until later, when gold was discovered in Alaska, that Americans very rapidly changed their tune and said, "Oh, we take back everything we said. There's gold." And I'm sure the Russians might have felt a little sad about that when they discovered they'd been sitting on a gold mine. But at that point, it was too late. And then, so that ended the period in 1867 of Russian colonization in Alaska. And in 1867, it would become American territory. But there are still vestiges of Russian colonization to this day. There's still a very small Eastern Orthodox population. There's still even some populations that can trace some of their ancestry back to Russia. But one of the most prominent signs that is still existing in Alaska to this day of the Russian colonial period is perhaps some of the Orthodox churches that have managed to kind of stay in operation and remain in the state even to this day. There's a big one in Sitka to this very day that is still in operation. Now, this is a picture from 1908, but this shows well after 50 years, almost 50 years after the purchase of Alaska, there was still Russian churches going on quite strongly, even almost 50 years after the Russians had left Alaska. But then some of those continue to this very day. So, not the longest of videos, like I said, it was more of a brief video. I wanted to discuss a little bit of where the Russians got involved in North America, and it just happened that Alaska was the main one, and give a little bit more background to people who are aware that the Russians colonized Alaska, but weren't really aware of a lot of the history of it. So that was what this was for. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, or anything of that nature, feel free to put them in the comment section below, and I will be more than happy to go through them when I can. As for our next video next week, I don't know what it'll be yet. I'm I'm kind of leaning toward something that I got. I got a topic I think in my mind, but I'm not 100% sure if we're going that, so I can't say anything as to yet what next week will be. But we'll get to it when we get to it. So hopefully everyone has a good weekend, a good holiday weekend. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday, and it sounds like we're getting an absolutely cold Arctic blast to accompany that, plus a presidential inauguration, which only happens every 4 years. So it's going to be a very eventful but cold weekend, I'm sure. So hopefully everyone stays warm, everyone stays safe, and we'll see you all back here for the next video next week when that comes out.